wearing shorts. Phil Courtier to my left wearing his Hawaiian shirt. You know? We've got a variety of sandals and all sorts of other things as well. So it's really good here. I'm going to turn around because the way it's designed, see who's here. We've got lots of people on the screen. We're just going to let some people in the lobby, so that's coming there. Good, right, okay. So today we've got the agenda. We'll rattle through the stuff. The key thing is on nutrient neutrality. We'll spend most of the time on that, and then have a quick chat on the other stuff as we get in there. Okay, it says minutes and matters arising from the 25th of January. Was that the last time we met formally, Neiman? The last public meeting. Okay, well, I know we've had a series of informal briefings since then. Does anybody object to the accuracy of those minutes? I shall take that as a no. Good, right. Minutes and matters arising, just done that. Nutrient neutrality. Hey, here we are. So I'm really pleased that we're making good progress on this. I think the best thing to do probably is cut straight to the team from Royal Haskoning. On your behalf, we had a pre-meeting last week, so we know what's some of us know what's coming up here. I think it's really important that we understand where we are in this process. Success ultimately looks like we'll have got all the nutrient neutrality stuff done, and what I would call normal business is resumed. But it's not going to be quite as easy as that. So I think what we will hear and what we will understand when we've got Haskoning on the call in a moment and doing their presentation is I think we're going to end up with a series of baby steps. Baby steps possibly as early as next week. I see Phil Courtier's fallen over. But there will be a number of planning applications which are currently ensnared in the nutrient neutrality, which we may decide momentarily when we look at the evidence. Do you know what? There's a small number here, potentially 20% of them we could probably start to release. And then there's going to be a series of refinements as we go through month by month, widening the net as we get more confidence, as we do more work, as we make, as a court case published over the weekend, which is a challenge to nutrient neutrality in the Havant area in Hampshire, what the judge describes as the authorities, the competent authorities, that's us as planning authorities, make cogent arguments. That's the words they use. So if we can make the cogent arguments over the next few months in a series of steps, we'll be able to progressively consent more and more of the backlog. I still don't have an answer. We'll take some arguments on this later on, whether the outline planning permissions, the reserve matters, are drawn into the net or not. Charlie Banner, QC, says they're not. Simon Bird, QC, says they are. So we may just have to have a bit of a tiebreaker and ask somebody else to have a go. So look, we'll come to Royal Haskoning in a moment. I'm still having trouble with my IT, but there we are. But Natalie wants to chip in from the Broads Authority first. Then, right, if you can hear us, we're just going to try and resolve these technical issues. I think the whole county council's internet's gone down, to be honest, because I'm still not getting those emails. Spam. Okay, so so what we're just going to do is disconnect ourselves and then readmit ourselves. Hopefully that won't break it. If it does, you'll have to all dial in back again, and because we can't see anybody moving, so that means nobody else outside this room will be able to participate. So apologies for those people watching at home. We're just going to have a bit of a reset. And we'll join you momentarily, that is if you can still hear us. Let us know when we can go again. I think your PC's had it. Well, I think the whole network has dropped out totally. Okay, I'm talking back at the feedback now.
Echo, 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 echo.
Has anybody got it on in this room here? Right, I think we've got it. So Trevor Wiggett was to blame. He had his speakers on. We'll rusticate him later. Right, apologies for that. We're now going to resume at 9 minutes past 11. So just bear with me while we get everyone on the screen. Hey, we ran into a problem reconnecting. It's off again. Now it's frozen again. Oh no, finally, I've got some email here. Okay, so, right, we've got everyone moving. Now we're mute. Right. Can anybody hear me? Can someone just wave their hand if they can hear us? Good, right, good. Right, we're back in the room. Apologies for all that. So let me in and then we'll be all right. Okay, so apologies for those. There we are. So I'll put myself on mute. That's it, right, good. Okay, so I can see everyone here as well. Good, okay. So I'm not quite sure how much of that we all got there. So we're going to go straight to a presentation by Royal Haskonian, which is going to lay out, in the first instance, the baby steps I think we can take immediately in certain circumstances to release certain planning applications which have been held up in very particular locations. And then we'll see a direction of travel that we'll work on with a series of refinements. And I think, and we're all in your hands.
John, sorry to interrupt you, but you're very difficult to hear. You sound like you're in an echo chamber.
Press the button. Right, how's that?
A lot better.
Is this a lot better? Right.
Yeah, that's right.
In that case, we're going to use my PC. Right, okay, right. I think right, here we are. Well done, the County Council, for wasting £2 million on a system that doesn't work. Right. So how are we going to progress this then? We're going to have to turn the TV down.
That's directly.
So you have to turn it down.
Sure. The team's meeting when they're talking to you.
Does that work if you log that and just look at my screen then?
Sorry.
Can you log out your full screen?
Well, it'll use this.
Hang on a minute, guys. Okay, so how does that sound? Can we hear that? Right, that's acceptable. Fine. Right, okay, well, we've got a solution. Thank you for that. Right, okay. On the third time of asking, let's go straight to Royal Haskonian. Ian, are you going to lean on this one? Or well done.
Hello, John. Yeah, hopefully you can hear me. Yes, it'll be myself and Oliver who'll be in the lead here.
Good. Right. Well, you and I had a meeting, didn't we, earlier in the week? Why don't you just go straight for it, and we'll pick up the pieces as we go through. And apologies for the IT logistics stuff.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Hopefully everyone can see that screen and it's in the room as well. Yep. Okay. Perfect. So yeah, I'm Oliver Bowers. I'm a nutrient and charge specialist at Royal Haskonian. We're giving the presentation today, joined by my colleague Ian Dennis, if he wants to introduce himself.
Hi everyone, Ian Dennis from Royal Housekeeping DHV. I'm technical director on this project, and I'm supporting Oliver to deliver the work.
Okay, I think that's seconds. Yeah, so just to give you a bit of idea of the kind of the context behind it all, I'm sure some people are familiar with it, but for those who aren't, essentially we're kind of the Dutch nitrogen case is what's brought around this ruling and this guidance from Natural England. And what that Dutch case ruled was that where you've got internationally important sites, in this case the SACs, where they're kind of failing to achieve condition because of a bad pollution loading already, you can't add any additional pollutants, in this case the nitrates and the phosphates, to that environment. And that's kind of informed the habitat regulations, and it's Natural England's interpretation of that ruling, which has ultimately led to the issues that we're currently facing up and down the country as well. And it's not necessarily just it's not specific to the European Union, so Brexit doesn't have much of an impact on that ruling, and the habitat regulations have been kind of transcribed into UK law following the UK's exit from the European Union, so that doesn't have too much of an impact on it. So ultimately it all comes down to this Dutch nitrogen case. It kind of went through the European courts, and it came around for a scheme that was going on in the Netherlands at the time, and that was challenged by NGOs, ultimately looking at how mitigation was delivered for these sites. And then in terms of the environmental context, so there's lots of high levels of nutrient inputs into the water environment, particularly in these catchments, the catchment of the Wensum and the Broads. And what that can do is lead to increased algal growth and eutrophication, which can have a kind of, it's a negative feedback, so it just gets worse and worse and worse. And what can that ultimately means is that it provides a significant threat to biodiversity in the surface water, excessive shading, depletion of oxygen, fish deaths, bad smells. It's not good. So yeah, as I said, it's the Natural England interpretation of the ruling. So the letter came in March 2022. I think the initial kind of nutrient neutrality stuff kind of started in 2019, 2020 in the Solent, moved over to Somerset, been in and around Kent as well, Cornwall, and Hereford, and it's kind of just slowly working its way around the country. So the latest new issue guidance was March 2022, but yeah, there was some before that. So Natural England's letter kind of helped to clarify a few things. There wasn't too much guidance prior to that, but what they're essentially saying now is that the nutrient neutrality is intended to allow those developments to proceed, providing that they can show there's no additional nutrients into that environment. So developers must demonstrate nutrient neutrality or provide mitigation to achieve that nutrient neutrality, and then the LPA gives them the confidence that they're meeting the requirements of the habitat regulations, which ultimately is what needs to be met here. And yeah, it's kind of nutrient neutrality. They're saying that it's intended to be an interim solution whilst they return the habitat sites to favourable condition. So a lot of the SSSIs that underpin these designated sites, that they're in the bad condition, and it's about trying to get those into more of a positive condition. And they call it an interim solution, but I think it's not something that's going to be done in the next couple of years. It's still very much a longer term solution, but they are seeing it as it's not necessarily going to be around forever until they can start to resolve the problem in those habitat sites. But yeah, we do need to do something about it, particularly in the short term.
It's worth saying, Oliver, isn't it, that there is over the weekend a Court of Appeal judgment which defines precisely the different roles of the various players, Natural England, ourselves, and also makes some suggestions as to the materiality of what changes can be made. Are you aware of that? I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah, that'd be useful if you could put it in the chat. Yeah, I think there's been a lot of talk about whose role it is to do what, and the input that Natural England needs to do, the Environment Agency, and kind of providing support as well. I think, yeah, the more clarity on that, the better, really.
But what the Court of Appeal judgment, and you can download it and read it for yourself, says in essence is that absolutely the councils as planning authorities are the competent authority. Clearly, they need to have regard to what Natural England may say, but they don't have to follow it slavishly, provided they make cogent arguments based on science, a scientific approach. Then we're entitled to form our own views in our own areas. We don't have to necessarily accept every interpretation that Natural England give us.
Okay, well, that's good, and I suppose that follows on nicely to some of the work we're going to be talking about in a minute. Okay, back to the protected habitat. So yeah, we've got the River Wensum, which is designated for a chalk river. I think the chalk rivers are very important habitats and worldwide important habitats, and we do see quite an abundance of the worldwide the percentage of chalk rivers in kind of south and south east and east of England. So it's a particular hotspot for these really important chalk rivers and the habitat that those chalk rivers provide. And yeah, the River Wensum it's a single river catchment, so it's basically a large chunk of the River Wensum is designated as that SAC. Alternatively, you kind of got the Broads, which is a bit more of a wider area. So that's the kind of designated for its rich aquatic plants and the invertebrate communities that are there, and that's made up of multiple triple SIs. But ultimately, kind of they've picked out certain areas which has got the highest nutrient loading, and they're the areas that are of concern. And it's got multiple sources, multiple river catchments that flow through these the Broads as well, which means that the actual catchment, the nutrient neutrality catchment for this area is very, very big. And ultimately, it's got the Bure, the Wensum, and the Yare that all feed into these sites that have been picked out as the troublesome sites. So yeah, they're kind of just a bit more of a graphical interpretation as to what we're talking about. So on the left, you see the River Wensum, which obviously designated as a river, whereas on the right, we've got the Broads, which is picked up in the nutrient neutrality issue, and the different areas. You can see kind of the different river catchments as well, and how such a big area that is covered because of the large catchments of this area as well, with the Wensum itself actually flowing ultimately into the Broads as well. So yeah, the protected habitats, kind of a bit of an idea now of what the kind of catchments.
Yeah, Oliver, can we just step back one slide?
Mm-hmm.
So is this just back one to the maps? So what you've identified, I think, there is a subset, a refinement, is it not, of what the shaded area, and you've actually trimmed off some, or is that slide coming later?
That slide's coming later, but
okay.
Yeah, we have done a review of the catchment. I can go over kind of the specific areas in a minute, but yeah, we have managed to trim slightly.
Yeah, we should have said this is Natural England's definition of the catchments. We'll revisit a refined version in a minute, but this is the areas on the screen at the moment are the areas that Natural England have concerns over. Outside of those areas, they don't.
Okay, so what we're seeing within this catchment, so it's an overwhelmingly agricultural catchment and diffuse sources. So they're kind of, rather than point sources, they're kind of the more widespread sources. That's one of the main reasons that these designated sites aren't meeting their standards. Kind of one of your key diffuse sources really comes from agriculture. As well as the agricultural sources, you've got those point source polluters as well, and that's primarily looking at sewage discharges and also septic tanks. So yeah, the point sources kind of from the consented and unconsented also do provide quite an important nutrient input into the catchment. So it's not just agriculture, it's not just the wastewater and sewage treatment works and septic tanks, it's a combination of all of them, and I'll show you a little bit of the proportion of them in a minute. And kind of what are the implications of the nutrient neutrality guidance within the area. So I mean, this doesn't really just apply to the Norfolk area, it kind of applies to the whole country that's facing this issue. So yeah, for stalled planning applications, stalled economic growth plans, loss of confidence from investors, and it does present a bit of a threat to the economy and job security. There's thousands of proposed dwellings just in Norfolk that are caught up. I think over the course of the whole of the UK, the Home Builders Federation estimates around about 100,000 that's going to be caught up. And yeah, it's what we tend to see is the small and the medium-sized developments that are most worse off for this issue. They don't have the resources or the capacity, the funding. They can't put up those capital costs to fund some of the mitigation, and they don't have the space on site themselves to also deliver some of that mitigation. So they're essentially the ones that they're a little bit stuck. Whereas some of the large developers might be able to kind of go off and find their own mitigation. Typically, we're seeing it's those small and medium size. They're the ones that are getting the most stuck. Ian, should I pass over to you for this section?
Yeah, of course. So just before we get too far in, Councillor Fuller has just mentioned about catchments and that sort of thing. We just wanted to make sure that everyone was speaking on the same page about river catchments and connectivity within them. So really what we're talking about here is something that happens in one part of a catchment can potentially influence what goes on in another part, particularly in this context. In the context of nutrients, this connectivity is downstream. So if something's upstream of a nutrient source, it's not likely to be affected, but conversely, something downstream of a nutrient source is potentially affected. And the image on the right there looks like a tree, but it's from the Environment Agency's Catchment Management Handbook, which sort of says, tries to encapsulate the fact that anything going on in a drainage basin can have these downstream impacts. So the reason why this is particularly important is in this context is that some of these catchments aren't connected directly to each other. Some are, but some aren't. So that's something that we can perhaps park and but come back to in a minute. And it's particularly important for some of the Broads, some of the Broads SAC units. Back to you, Ollie, I think.
Let me change. Yeah, okay. So now we're just going to run through a little bit of our scope of works. So ultimately, the key project aim is to unlock the development in Norfolk, and this is kind of how we're going to go about it. So some of these tasks we've already completed or nearing completion. Some of these are future tasks. So one of our first tasks was to do a literature review and source apportionment. That just allows us to get a really good appreciation of the catchment and kind of where the key sources are. Ultimately, one of the first key tasks we want to be doing is looking at the calculator. So that's looking at the Natural England published calculator and seeing how we can improve and refine that and make it more specific. Catchment mapping exercise, which has been done, which I'll show you the kind of the finalised version of that. But that's ultimately looking at Natural England's catchment and looking at the wastewater treatment works and getting a definitive boundary of what's included in the nutrient neutrality and what's not. Then looking at kind of the connectivity mapping, so kind of see if there are areas that are potentially a lower risk of nutrients finding their way into the designated sites. Then once we've got the catchment map sorted, we move on to nutrient budgets, and then we kind of start looking at the short term and the long term solutions, and ultimately that's leading towards the nutrient neutrality policy. So just a bit of an overview of the literature review. So yeah, completing an evidence-based review of the River Wensum on the Broads, just kind of get that understanding of the nutrient problem and the catchment characteristics. And what that allows us to do is we can kind of see certain areas where some solutions might work better and some solutions might not necessarily work in catchments. That's kind of looking at topography, looking at what's previously been done in these areas and kind of learning from mistakes as well. And yeah, it just gives us a bit of an evidence base going forwards as well. And then we also looked at the source apportionment. So this is the phosphate loading only for the Wensum and the Broads. And as you can see there, a large proportion of that is coming from livestock and arable on the Wensum. And there's still quite a big sources coming from the sewage treatment works, and urban is actually quite a large source in that catchment as well. Whereas moving over to the Broads, agriculture is still quite a big input, but you see a much bigger input there from the sewage treatment works, and that peach coloured one, that's the on-site wastewater treatment works. That's essentially the septic tanks and the package treatment plants. So we can kind of see there that there's a slight difference between the sources, and what that allows us to do is kind of, when we look at this on an operational catchment scale, so we'll have a look at the Wensum, the we can also look at it on a sub-catchment scale as well, so kind of seeing within the Wensmouth for certain areas where there's a big proportion of sources that kind of differs from what we're seeing for the whole of that catchment, and kind of see if there's any targeted solutions that could be done in that area there. And yeah, this just gives us a bit of an understanding of how to base the calculator and ultimately kind of the strategy development. So the nutrient calculator, this is kind of taking up most of our time at the minute, and it's what we're kind of focusing most of our efforts on. So it's about trying to develop a calculator that is generic enough that it can be used by all of the applicants and the developers within the Norfolk region, but it needs to be specific, it needs to be rapid, it needs to be able to ultimately quantify what the phosphate and the nutrient and the nitrate loading will be from that specific development. So Natural England previously published guidance on nutrient calculators back in 2020, November 2020 was their first guidance, and there have been calculators published in the UK on the back of that guidance, and then in March 2022 they've updated that guidance and actually published their own calculators that have been sent to each of the local authorities. So what we're basically doing is looking at that Natural England calculator that's been published and looking at the guidance that comes with it, and just kind of reviewing the sources that they've used, the inputs, looking at where they've used precautionary principles, and particularly where they've started to layer precautionary principles. So you do kind of see precautionary principle after precautionary principle all kind of doubled up on top of each other, and ultimately it does come across as a little bit too precautionary. So the calculator considering both phosphates and nitrates within this area. And as I said, it kind of we're trying to make it as regional specific to Norfolk as well. So we're looking at the rainfall data, looking at soil types, but we're trying to provide an evidence base for that as well. It kind of comes back to the previous comments there. Kind of we need to make sure that what we're saying is evidence based, and we've got the data to back that up. So we've previously produced calculators in Somerset, Cornwall, Shropshire that have been endorsed by Natural England. So kind of using that as a bit of a base. And yeah, we're still kind of looking at the exact data that's kind of fitting into that. And there's a few more inputs that need to come in. But yeah, the calculators are pretty much ready to go. We just need to kind of sort out those last few things. And yeah, but I think ultimately these calculators, I think it's worth bearing in mind that if we can try and get the nutrient loading down as much as possible and prevent these precautionary principles, what that then means in the future is that you don't have to provide as much mitigation. So this is ultimately a way of trying to get that mitigation requirements down as low as possible, whilst also making it an improved calculator that's regional specific and evidence based as well. So
okay, so jump in. So just to jump in there, guys. So we're going to sack off the Natural England default calculator that's been provided to us. It's a pile of the proverbial, and instead, and I'll just put it in the chat relating to the recent Court of Appeal thing, by identifying people with the sufficient scientific, technical, and predictive assessments, the appropriate expertise, and highly dependent on a variety of assessment, complex technical matters. The court will entertain those. So Haskoning have all the appropriate expertise, predictive and other skills. So it doesn't. It's not a disaster that we can do this. We're entirely entitled to have our own calculator, and that's the outcome. And when do you think this is going to be ready as a sort of a phase one, even though we may refine it later, Oliver?
We've still got a few inputs to put in ourselves, but we're also waiting on other inputs from other organisations as well. We've tried chasing those, but it's hard to put a timescale on when they can provide the data. But hopefully, it's a couple of weeks sort of a time frame. I think we're looking at really.
Essentially, though, the tool as it stands is up and running. Anything else would just be a refinement round the edge. So there is some data from Natural England. Ambient water that we're awaiting, but that won't change a lot of the scenarios. It basically gives a little bit more refinement in some areas.
As we go through the meeting and get to the conclusions at the end, one of the things I'll invite members to consider is whether we're quite happy to have a okay, I'll have to speak a bit louder then. One of the things which we're going to have to consider later in this meeting is whether we're happy to have this sort of iterative number of steps. So we have a preliminary calculator, which we're happy with, and then by degrees over the ensuing weeks and months, we issue further refinements, which developers and planning officers will be able to use as it goes along. So I think what we've heard today is that Haskoni have come up with a really good version 1.0, and later in this meeting we'll be seeking to seek member endorsement for sort of placing that into the.
John,
Go on, Graham.
John, I was just going to say, you were fine wearing the headset. When you took it off, it was sometimes difficult to hear. I think what happened was you froze temporarily. So I'd vote for you to keep.
Yeah, sorry about that. Somebody in the room then said he couldn't hear what I was saying. So anyone else in the room is going to have to come and sit next to me. They can hear. There we are. So, right, Graham, go on.
Yeah, thank you, John. As this is a technical planning issue, the people who should be agreeing to this are the planners in the various districts. So from that point of view, if it fits the criteria that's needed for that district to agree planning permissions based on the calculator, then those officers need to be in agreement with that calculator to make sure in their individual areas to make sure that that fits their criteria, because what we need is a working calculator that's going to work in the particular areas that the planning application has been put in. So again, it's a technical agreement between planning officers. This shouldn't be for members to agree. This should be for officers with their technical expertise to agree this.
I hear what you say, but I think planning officers just need to understand they've got sufficient cover to go baby steps first, rather than waiting all the way to the end for the big reveal and lose that time. So I think it is important that members are comfortable with the concept of iterative steps, because the counterfactual is we just wait until it's absolutely perfect, which could be forever.
Again, it's one of those things that a decision that a planner has to make, not a member.
So John, sorry to interrupt. His suggestion is that we have these iterations of the calculator, which would then enable us to start issuing planning consents gradually, or do we have to wait for the big reveal before we can actually?
I think that's the aim, Mike, but perhaps we could just hang on and just go through the rest of the presentation. But I just wanted to frame the importance of the calculator and its status today, and its status which could change in September, October, November as we get more and more refinements. Right. If you just bear with me, because I've got a colleague here who's going to have to put his headphones on. He doesn't want to talk after all. Okay. Trevor Wiggett wants to talk, so we're going to see whether we can make the microphones work.
Hello, can you hear me? Can anyone hear me? Are you dialed in? Hi, I'm connected to Paul, so hopefully you can hear me now. I think it's clear to make a contrast between two elements that we're looking at here. One is the calculator. The calculator informs us on the nutrient that a new development will deliver. But what we're also looking at is a distance and risk map, and that is something which is more sort of scientifically debatable. The calculator isn't something which is going to open up development again, but it's going to tell you what a nutrient load for a specific development is. What it will do, because we've altered the calculator from the Natural England one, is it will lower the nutrient load that a development will have. So there'll be less mitigation that will be required as a result of that specific development.
So for the purpose of this meeting, we've completed step one, which is to identify, what nutrients a particular development may yield. And now we're going to go on to step two once we've been through this worked example. And step two is, so you know how much phosphate you're leaching. Is it acceptable in the particular location the development requires. Sorry, Oliver, or Ian, do you just want to go down into the works example?
Mhm. So yeah, what I've done here is just a very simple kind of generic works example, just to give you a bit of an idea of the inputs we're putting into the calculator, and then also offer a comparison between the Natural England calculator as well. So in this example, we've fairly small development, we've got 5 dwellings. Natural England are saying that you should be using an average occupancy of 2.4, which is the national average, and kind of stayed around that level for a good 40, 50 years perhaps. Whereas what we're proposing is to use a slightly lower average, which is specific to Norfolk. So at the minute, that's 2.2. The trend is actually going down. So in 20, 30 years' time, that probably will look something around about 2.1. So yeah, that's kind of using a localized, regional specific average occupancy. So that's people's per dwelling. So ultimately, we're saying there's 2.2 persons for every dwelling. And that does need to be kind of used consistently throughout the calculators, and kind of throughout policy as well. It's just a couple of things that need to be checked on that, but we're kind of trying to propose to use that slightly lower value of 2.2. And I think it's kind of a common trend that we're seeing throughout this. It's not kind of major whole-scale changes to the Natural England guidance, so we're still kind of taking their same principles and there's kind of the same calculations, but it's just the inputs that we're slightly changing, and it's just kind of small little changes that kind of start to add up eventually. So yeah, moving on, we're looking at the water usage. So we propose to use a water usage of 110 litres per person per day, and that's the lower limit of the building regulations. So Natural England are also suggesting to use 110, but what they want to see is an additional 10 litres per person per day to account for any future changes, which brings us up to 120. But we've kind of done a bit of a literature review to try and find the evidence base for trying to add that extra 10 litre per person per day, and there doesn't really seem to be enough evidence to suggest that that's required. And I think that is, again, is something that we'd challenge and try and go back to the 110. The 110 is evidence based. It's the building regulations, and it was used in the previous versions of the calculator prior to March 2022. So that's what we try and use there. So just running through that 5 dwellings through the average occupancy and the water usage, that comes to 1,210. And that's litres per day that's going to be running through the treatment works. So you can see already just those small little changes does make a bit of a difference in terms of the values that we're working with. So that's the wastewater volume. So yeah, I probably should have said at the start, the calculator is split into a couple of different sections. So the stage 1 is looking at the wastewater loading. Stage 2 is looking at the current land use. Stage 3 is looking at what the future land use might be, and stage 4 kind of provides a bit of a summary of all of those different inputs. And I'm going to come on to it in a little bit and kind of maybe show everyone at the end if we've got time, kind of how we also progress on to different stages beyond the Natural England guidance, which looks at potential for solutions, and kind of uses some nice calculators which can look at zero values and that sort of thing as well. So we kind of run a bit of indication mitigation as well. So yeah, just coming back to where we are in this works example, so looking at the wastewater loading. So we then, assuming that in this example we go to a treatment works, there's also the option to use on-site treatment works, so packaged treatment plants or septic tanks. But yeah, let's say we're draining to Dereham, which has a permit limit of 1 milligram per litre, but we assume that the water companies are operating around 90% of that permit limit because they never want to exceed it, because then they're subjecting themselves to fines. So naturally, the guidance says we should assume it's around about 90% of what they're operating at. We'll come on to a bit of an evidence base at that later, but for now, that's what we're assuming. So the wastewater loading for this development using the Natural England calculator is 0.47 for the phosphates, that's the TP, 14.2 for the TN, which is the nitrates. And then comparing that to our calculator with a few minor changes, does reduce it slightly, so that's 0.40 for the TP and 11.93 for the TN. So yeah, a couple of small changes there. So that's our wastewater loading. Then moving on to the different land uses. So there's lots of different catchment parameters that can control what the drainage, what the nutrient runoff is from the agricultural land or the current land use and the future land use. So it depends on what catchment you're in. what river catchment. So in this case, we're assuming we're in the Wensum. It depends on the soil type, which I suppose does make sense. If you kind of got more freely draining soil compared to more impermeable soil, the more impermeable soil is going to increase the surface water runoff and increase the likelihood of those nutrients finding their way into watercourses and ultimately into the designated sites. So in this case, in Dereham, we've kind of normally we're on impermeable soil, which is generally drained for arable. So it's not completely freely draining, but it's also not completely impermeable. It's kind of a bit of a mix in between. The rainfall, I think the rainfall is quite an important thing to kind of go into. So Natural England's rainfall data was looking at, I think, data that finished in 1991. So at the best, it was about 30 years old, and it's Met Office data. So what we've done is provide some more up-to-date data. So I think from around about 2000 up to 2021, we've got the same sort of Met Office, which is the standard annual average rainfall data, the SSAR data. So it's the same source, but it's much more up to date, and that allows us to kind of give a bit more certainty, more of an evidence base of the rainfall that we're using. So what we're seeing really is that the rainfall is typically between about 600 and 800 millimeters per year. If we were to take an average of that, it'd be around about 685, 690. And I think so. The way that the Farmscaper works, and Farmscaper is a tool that we use to derive all the agricultural runoff values, is you have boundaries between 600 and 700 and 700 and 900. So what we've been able to do is look at 1 kilometre grid squares for the whole of the catchment, see what the average rainfall is that from the data, and categorise it into either the 600 to 700 category or the 700 to 900, and kind of map that back on itself again, so in those 1 kilometre grid squares. And that means rather than assuming that the average is between 600 and 700, if it was 690, it allows us to not underestimate the rainfall in those areas that are above that in the 700 to 900 category. So it's just making sure that we are using the most up-to-date data, and that we're making sure that it's specific, and we're not kind of just taking an average across the whole of that region. And that does start to get lower total loading values, which is what we want. And in this case, we're also within a nitrate vulnerable zone. So I've just said we've got 1 hectare of cereals, so cereal farming, and then that is being converted into 1 hectare of urban land. And what we're trying to do is propose different types of urban land as well. So the Natural England calculator just assumes that all urban land is the same and has quite high precautionary values on the impervious land, and the amount of impervious land that is in that catchment of the urban land. So Natural England are assuming it's around about 80% of urban land is impervious, which is kind of what you'd normally see on an industrial estate. So if you kind of think of all the tarmac that you'd find in an industrial estate, that's normally around about 80% impervious cover, whereas what we actually kind of tend to see in some of those urban lands is a lot less than that. And we're also trying to see if we can split that into kind of high intensity, what you might find in cities, medium intensity sort of urban land, which is getting a little bit more rural, kind of semi-rural, and then looking at low intensity, which would be kind of your rural dwellings. And you've got the evidence base to back that up, that the impervious cover reduces as you get more and more rural. So yeah, that's what we're trying to derive our urban coefficients slightly differently. So looking at the
very quickly, sorry to jump. Is that bad news for the city? Does that mean to say that that the bar's going to be higher for us?
It's already at 80% anyway with the Natural England evidence base. So I think what we found is kind of ranging between about 50 and 70%. So it's probably will still decrease that urban value, but it's not going to decrease it as much as it would for the others. But ultimately, it's already 80% anyway. So if we can try and get it down a little bit, it does help.
Okay.
Okay. So just to summarise this slide. This is the story of how we won all that cycling in the Olympics in 2012 by having a series of small marginal gains that added up to a big gain, and then we carted away all the gold medals. So what I think we've seen here is on the left-hand side, right at the bottom, there's 1.74 kilograms of total phosphate, TP, under the Natural England value. And for this particular specimen, 5-house development in Dereham, sewage works located in the Wensum, the new value, our own Norfolk calculator, using our own bespoke values, has gone down to 0.43 kilograms of total phosphate. It's the difference between half a carrier bag and a small cereal packet. And I think, we're getting down to really very low values of total phosphate. Whether those low values are acceptable, we'll see later in this presentation. But you can start to see that 0.43 is 24% on the calculator, our own calculator value, compared to what it is on Natural England. So we're really starting to make some really big inroads into reducing the size of the mountain we've got to climb using accurate, bespoke data suited to our circumstances. And indeed, there may in due course be even further savings to shave off this, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. So, Ollie, it's now time to move on.
Yeah. I think the only thing I'd also worth pointing out there is the nitrates as well. So in this specific example, the nitrates is actually negative, meaning that by developing that, you'll be saving on your nitrate loading, so you won't have to provide any nitrate mitigation in this case, but you would still have to provide the 0.43 total phosphate mitigation. But as you said, that's a lot lower than what the Natural England calculation is coming out. Obviously, this is our first kind of iteration of the calculator. We've still got to kind of look at that evidence base, see if it's going to be acceptable as well. But yeah, this is our first draft. Then, so this is, kind of what's been previously alluded to. So this is not something that we've put in at the minute, but this is another potential kind of future iteration we could do to the calculator. So this is looking at the permit limits for the sites that have phosphate stripping in. So the sites that have a permit limit. And this is all the sites that within the Norfolk area that have got those permit limits. At the minute, as I previously said, we're assuming it's operating around about 90% of their permit limits. What we've actually managed to get is data over the last couple of years to see what the actual discharge concentration is from those sites, and what that's kind of shown in this column here. So that's what we're actually discharging at, rather than the assumed discharge, which is around 90%. Just to kind of make that a little bit more simple to understand, is rather than this being 90%, this is the actual average discharge percentage. So for the whole of those treatment works, it's around about 66%, rather than it being 90%. But that is the average, which isn't necessarily applying a precautionary principle, or it's more subject to increases or potential decreases. But there is the potential that if there's more properties added into that catchment, that average value could increase, in which case the calculator would be underestimating the loading, which is not really a situation we want to get into. So what you can do instead is looking at one standard deviation away from that mean average value, which still provides a good indication as to kind of a precautionary upper limit of what we'd expect those treatment works to continue operating around. And that comes out as around about 76%. On average, and some of them are much lower than that. So some are kind of operating around 62% in some cases. So yeah, that is one standard deviation, and that's a more bespoke value. It's evidence-based that we could use instead of assumingly operating at 90%. I expect this is something that Natural England probably would want to have a bit of a conversation about, and potentially wouldn't be too willing to accept it. And I kind of the Angling Waters kind of take on it as well is that they have permit limits and they kind of operate around that, and they kind of don't want to be bound to lower permits. But I suppose what we could kind of say is that this is evidence based, and if you were to review those average concentrations every few months or so, then you're at least keeping up with what the data is showing, and make kind of amendments to the calculator on that basis. And ultimately, in terms of kind of updating the calculator more generically, not just looking at this, is that in terms of the HRA, you really need to be using the best available evidence at the time to make that decision. And that calculator at the time of making a decision would be the best available evidence. And if that is to be updated in the future, then so be it. At the time the decision was made, the previous calculator was the best evidence available at the time.
Okay, guys, so it's really important that we talk about this, because if I just put on the chat, the legal test, as told to us over the weekend by the Court of Appeal, Lord Justices, says ultimately we need to be, as competent authorities, satisfied there is no reasonable doubt as to the absence of adverse effects on the integrity of the site concerned. So if we can knock the amount of nutrients down to the lowest possible layer to begin with, it reduces the even possibility of the adverse effects on the integrity of the site, and that makes our job of mitigation so much easier. So good piece of work. Does that sort of complete the first lesson, Ollie? Are we now going to get on to sort of how, so having got the calculator and how much phosphate there is, put nitrogen to one side for a moment, that's the size of the mountain we've got to climb. Now we need to see where the mountains are within Norfolk, and there are some, even though it's flat. I'll just come to Graham first, and then there's a colleague who's going to have to come to the front.
Yeah, just a question. How much of this has been shared with the local authority planning officers for ratification of figures and numbers? I mean, has it been shared wider than this group at the moment, or have officers have seen it?
Graham,
Right, Phil Cordier is going to answer this one.
Thank you.
yes, Graham, this is overseen by the Directors Steering Group. And so this has been presented, and these figures have been presented to that Directors Steering Group. And then I can only assume that that will then cascade down to the relevant officers. I've certainly been discussing it with the planning officers at both Broadland, well, representing both Broadland and South Norfolk.
Okay, thank you very much. You're on mute, John.
So the question from the room here is, has any consideration been given to stormwater overflows as part of these discussions and calculations?
The calculator itself can't really look at the stormwater overflows. They do form part of the permit limits that the treatment works are operating at. It's not something that the calculator really looks at. It's something we can look at in terms of potential mitigation. So kind of seeing if there are any certain areas where there's going to be high concentration, we could get potential nutrient gains from correcting that problem. Yeah, but it's not something that we really looked at in the calculator too much.
Okay, so we now know as planning officers and developers how much phosphate and nitrogen our proposals will generate. But is what is being generated acceptable? Ollie, on to part 2 of this presentation, please.
Yeah, so just one thing that we quickly wanted to look at is the catchment mapping. So this is just redefining Natural England's catchment map, as we kind of previously mentioned. So there was the Natural England catchment map. We've gone over that, and essentially, I think the way they derived it was looking at topographical data, and it was very squarey. So the kind of the data that they'd used was quite coarse. So it's just kind of going in and redefining that and smoothing that over in certain areas, and just checking that the connections that they've said are present are really are there. So yeah, just trying to get a solid, definitive idea of what's in the catchment and what's outside of the catchment. So there's a tiny area kind of in the northeast of the catchment, which is slightly refined, but ultimately the rest of the catchment has pretty much stayed the same, with just a couple of bits of smoothing around the edges. And then what the real purpose of doing this is so that we can add on the water recycling centre, so that there's wastewater treatment works catchments to the surface water catchment. And what we can have there is we can look at the discharge location of those treatment works and see whether or not they sit inside the catchment, the surface water catchment, or outside that surface water catchment. And if they lie inside of that catchment, the surface water catchment, there's sewage treatment works, then all of the areas caught up in the sewage treatment works catchment also need to use the calculator, the wastewater treatment works, so stage 1 of the calculator. But we do have a couple of cases where there are sewage treatment works that drain outside of the catchment, but have their own catchment that's inside of the sewage, the surface water catchment. And what that allows is you to say that actually those properties, that, although they may be inside the surface water catchment, their wastewater is going to go outside. So they only need to consider stages 2 and 3, which is the change in land use. So it's just kind of adding a kind of a clear idea of what's included and what's not. I won't dwell on it too much, but this is kind of just an example of what we've been looking at. So this kind of the catchment, which we've managed to redefine. There's a couple of changes here. And this essentially is kind of the examples that I'm talking about here, is that this wastewater treatment works here will drain outside of the catchment, so it drains somewhere around over here, but has a catchment. The wastewater treatment catchment does go into the service water catchment. So a development that will be located in this point here wouldn't have to consider wastewater treatment works. So stage 1 of the calculator would only need to consider stage 2 and stage 3. And wastewater loading is quite a big nutrient input, particularly for the nitrates as well. So yeah, just managing to work out what areas need to do that and what don't. It just means that we've kind of got a bit of a clear idea, and just making sure that we're not mitigating for something that we don't need to.
Yeah, Oliver, and just to help members understanding, the map you're showing is clearly around the Cromer Ridge, northeast Norfolk, and there are these red splodges. And as I see it, the red splodges are those areas which are on the mains. So if you're on main sewage that goes through an STW, you're in the red zone. But quite a lot of people around here are on septic tanks, they've got packaged plants and stuff like that. So they're the ones in the green zones, aren't they? Did you just want to explain that? Because it's quite significant for what comes later.
Yeah, exactly. I think when we kind of produce this and finalise it, we'll make sure it's colour coordinated as well. So it's not just going to be all red zones. We'll have I suppose green and red zones. The green areas that are outside the catchment, the red zones that are inside the catchment, just to make it a bit clearer exactly who needs to do what in what area. But yeah, ultimately, as you can see, and this is a really good example, really, is that the wastewater treatment network does have quite a few patches where it doesn't really serve certain areas. So there are a couple of very small areas that are kind of those unpermitted treatment works, but ultimately a lot of the areas will be served by package treatment plants and old septic tanks rather than finding their way to the mains.
So, spoiler alert, it may well be that if you're in one, to go back to the map, in one of the green zones, then we may absolutely be able to unlock developments for smaller sites subject to other considerations really very quickly. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. So what we've been looking at is this supply connectivity mapping, and essentially this is a bit of a heat mapping exercise, and the idea is it'll kind of highlight if there are any zones within the Norfolk region where we can say that there's a very low risk of nutrient sources finding their way into the designated sites. So there's kind of lots of different layers that make up this mapping. So one of the first things we'd look at is the wastewater treatment works catchment that we've previously seen. So is these red areas here, and we're saying anything that's within that catchment there would essentially have a bit of a direct pathway into the designated sites. So anything with that in that region there, you would say actually that the likelihood is that will increase the loading to those treatment works. And then we're also looking at the existing kind of the natural drainage network. So looking at the ditches, the streams, the rivers that are going to find their way. And if nutrients get into those streams, they are going to find their way into the designated sites. And looking at the natural drainage, so that's looking at OS data that we've got for that, looking at Environment Agency main rivers mapping, and also trying to bring in flood risk data as well. And what the flood risk data does is that allows us to also kind of consider topography and see where you're going to have overland flow and where that's going to start to channelise and ultimately find its way into the designated sites. So it's kind of looking at all of those different layers and doing a heat mapping exercise to see if there are any areas where actually it's going to be located sufficiently far away from a drainage network, sufficiently far away or outside of the wastewater treatment works network, and we can say with certainty, fairly good certainty, given the evidence that we've got, that the development here might not necessarily, the nutrients might not find their way into the designated sites. So it's just trying to find those patches there. I think it's worth pointing out, especially kind of looking at this area here, is that a lot of the more urban areas are going to be caught within these wastewater treatment work boundaries, so it's not going to be able to apply to those. But as you can see, there are certain areas that are outside of those wastewater treatment works that are going to be reliant on the septic sanctions package treatment plants, that providing they're not close enough to the natural drainage network, we might be able to kind of put these in one of these areas that kind of say there's very low risk of the nutrients reaching the designated sites. So yeah, I think it's that risk-based approach. Importantly, Natural England and advice doesn't really accept this approach. It's not really something that's been done before, and there is the I suppose the risk of challenge either from Natural England or from the NGOs, which happened in the case of the Dutch nitrogen case, which ultimately led to this issue. So yeah, it's kind of the local authorities could kind of choose to adopt this approach to unlock some development if there is development in these areas. I think it's worth pointing out that yeah, it's not going to be those urban areas. It may be a lot more rural, so it's not really going to apply to large developments, but it might just allow some of those smaller developments that are more rural to go through.
Okay, I'll come to you in a moment, Sam Hubbard, if I may. But I think that sounds like a sort of a loophole, really, but it isn't. Because if you've got a septic tank that sort of goes into a field drain and that drain percolates all the way down into the groundwater ultimately, the outlet from that septic tank has never and will never impact on a special area of conservation. Remember, this whole thing isn't about reducing nutrients, although that is one of the byproducts. It's about what is the impact on one of the special areas of conservation. And if there's no reasonable chance of an outlet in a field drain or whatever touching the special area of conservation, then there's no reason for nutrient neutrality to apply. This is a really open and important sort of way forward, so I think it's really good. I'm going to come to Sam Hubbard, and then the gentleman's going to come forward within the room. Sam, you go first.
Thank you, Chair. Just on this point about the wastewater treatment works and their point of discharge, and we were able to establish quite early on within Great Yarmouth that our main treatment works at Caister discharges out to sea, and fortunately that serves all of the villages that we have within the nutrient neutrality catchment. So we did check in with Natural England early on, and they confirmed to us that we can rule out a likely significant effect where those dwellings are connected to the main sewage network. So I presume that same conclusion can be drawn for those other treatment works that you've identified where the outfall is outside of the catchment area.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, Ollie, come in.
Yeah, hang on, Oliver. So I was expecting you to respond to that.
Sorry, ultimately there'll be if it's outside of those, if it drains outside of the surface water catchment, we can say that you don't need to consider the wastewater. The original Natural England guidance did say that you still need to consider the surface water change if it's within inside the surface water catchment. But if it's outside the surface water catchment and the wastewater treatment works drainage doesn't drain into the surface water catchment, then it could be it would not need to consider the calculator.
Yes, Sam, did you want to come back?
I did, yeah, because the advice that we've had from Natural England is irrespective of whether it's in the surface water catchment or not. If the wastewater treatment works is outside of the catchment, then we can rule out likely significant effect. So again, presumably that will apply not just within Great Yarmouth, but in any circumstance in Norfolk where you've now identified a wastewater treatment works that is discharging outside of the catchment. This is for residential development, I should clarify. Clearly, if it's a pig farm or something that's going to have a huge amount of nutrient load into the soil, then that might be something different. But for the purposes of residential development, they've said we can rule out a likely significant effect in the same way that we can rule out a likely significant effect for commercial development, which they've already established, which might still be within the surface water area of the nutrient catchments. So you're quite keen that you don't go back on that, I suppose, progress that we've already made with Natural England.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that. Yeah, we'll certainly check that. And I suppose ideally we want to take that same approach across the whole of the catchment, because then we don't have to consider the change in land use. So yeah, I think that's an important raise, and I think we'll go back and check that.
There you go. Natural England and advice. There's an oxymoron there. But anyway, look, Tim sitting in the room is going to put on my headset and ask his question.
Okay. The essence of a chalk stream is that much of it's groundwater fed. So what happens with septic tanks? Are they not going to leak into the groundwater and therefore ultimately still reach the catchment system? Is that a challenge Natural England might consider?
Yes, I think it is. I think that's something that we're looking to bring into the model. Maybe perhaps in the next iteration, but it's something that we're looking to try and bring in. Yeah, there is, particularly when some chalk groundwater, there is potential there for kind of connectivity as well. So it's something that we do need to consider. Not currently considering it at the minute, but yeah, we're kind of trying to build that in and see how we could build it in. But yeah, I think you are right. That is something that Natural England probably would ask questions on. So we do need to kind of give that a bit of thought and kind of be prepared for any answers to that.
Mind you, of course, there are chalk aquifers under other catchments which may not necessarily feed into the Wensum. So again, there's some sophistication there. Right, okay, Ollie, let's get on to the next one after this.
Yeah, so I mean, this shouldn't take too long really now. So ultimately, once we've got our calculator sorted and agreed, then we'll start to look at the nutrient budgets. So that's looking at the housing requirements to the end of the local plan period, typically kind of looking around maybe 2040, kind of trying, yeah, and then putting that projected development through the calculator to ultimately find out how much the whole of the Norfolk region needs to deliver in terms of mitigation. I'm looking at that year by year and also looking at kind of geographically if there's any kind of hotspots or potential areas where we might struggle to deliver that. That kind of comes back to Natural England's principle that mitigation needs to be upstream of development. So kind of looking at along the Wensum catchment, if there might be some hotspot areas of development where it might be a bit of a challenge to look at the upstream mitigation sources there as well. So yeah, just kind of running it through the calculator and kind of working out what needs to be mitigated. There are obviously certain kind of assumptions you need to make on that, whether or not as a local authority they want to kind of deliver the whole mitigation as well, but kind of we'll provide all the figures that are required for that. And then what we're also going to be doing is looking at a screening tool and a heat mapping. So this is kind of separate to the heat mapping we've previously talked about. This is heat mapping for the purpose of trying to identify mitigation areas. And this is a nice example of what we've done in Somerset. So essentially, kind of got our ecologists to draw up a list of potential on-site designations that would prevent land use change. And if it does prevent land use change, that area there is unlikely to be useful for mitigation. We kind of stop looking in those areas for land-based mitigation schemes, kind of on potential areas and no areas. Kind of that's where you'd be really looking to see if you can deliver those land-based mitigation options. So it's just a bit of a GIS mapping exercise that just kind of points in the right direction and just gives us a bit of evidence base to work from. Then the solution assessments. This is a report that we're going to produce, and this will be literature review based, kind of looking at best practice guidance, and a lot of the work into what measures that can reduce nutrient inputs has already been done. And it's a lot of some of these processes have been in use for a couple of years. But what we really need to consider is how those solutions can be delivered in terms of the HRA, so making sure that they meet the requirements of the habitat regulations and Natural England's ultimate kind of their requirements as well. So that's kind of the task really, but we're going to kind of do quite a lot of experience in that through our work in Somerset and Cornwall, to trying to apply what we already know, what we've already learned into Norfolk, and making sure that it is specific to the Norfolk region as well. So kind of looking at the main categories as well. So we're looking primarily at nature-based solutions and looking at drainage-based solutions ultimately. So kind of the solution assessment, it'll look at the timescales for implementation, the timescales that the actual solution might be in place for, looking at regions, so kind of looking at different river catchments, as well as different local authorities. Ultimately, kind of looking at the nutrient removal potential, management and maintenance requirements, which is quite an important thing because for certain nature-based solutions, the management and the maintenance can be quite onerous and can actually be more than the capital cost to actually implement that solutions. Additional benefits again is something that's really important, and kind of seeing how that can tie with other schemes. And these last 4 questions are what we really need to ask ourselves to make sure we're meeting the requirements of the habitat regulation. So is it based on the best available evidence? Is that solution effective beyond reasonable scientific doubt? Is it going to deliver the nutrient mitigation that you're saying it's going to? Does it apply a precautionary approach? We need to make sure we're trying to make sure that we've got that precautionary principle in the back of our minds, and that kind of comes back to the fair judgment that's kind of reinforced the need to make sure you've got that precautionary approach in there. And can it be secured in perpetuity? So there's longer term solutions that are going to go for the whole of the kind of mitigate for the whole of the lifetime of the development. They need to make sure they can be delivered in perpetuity. So yeah, I mean, that's hoping kind of there's 2 stages. This kind of looking at short-term solutions and looking at some of the longer-term solutions, and kind of trying to tie that all up. So as well as kind of giving a bit of an idea of what the solutions are, we'll also be looking at specifically this region, what the nutrient removals are, what the likely cost of this is, and then kind of doing a bit of a ranking of this is, you know, pounds per kilograms per year of phosphate or nitrates that can be mitigated, just to give a bit of an idea of what's going to be the best solutions for the whole region, but also kind of in specific areas. Right, this is the solution that you should go for in this area, and that's more kind of looking at the longer term solutions, kind of basing the strategy around that. And then kind of looking towards the policy in the future. So that's kind of developing that nutrient neutrality policy, and kind of that's the technical work that underpins a potential kind of a system for administering and implementing their solutions. And it's still quite vague, I suppose, at this stage what that policy is going to look like, and that'll be developed as we kind of start progressing more with the short term and the longer term solutions. But that's ultimately kind of where we're heading. We're heading for that policy that gives us the weighting as well, which is quite important. Yeah, and kind of identifying the opportunities and the threats with kind of tariff-based systems and mitigation solutions. So yeah, that's kind of the end of our presentation. Not sure how much time we've got, or if anyone's kind of got any questions or anything you'd like to go a bit deeper into.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for that, Ollie. Ian, when you and I had our pre-meeting early last week, you showed another map, and I know it was computationally very difficult, and it was early doors on the sort of the buffers around the watercourses.
Yes,
it's clearly work that isn't ready yet, but I just don't know whether you have a slide available where you could show that. This isn't the final. It isn't the final approach. Having said that, it does demonstrate a line of thinking, which I think members would find useful. Here we are, over to you. So I'll let you pick up the cudgels on this. So this is very illustrative at the moment, but again, you saw that heat map from Somerset, which sort of showed sort of red stop, green go areas. And this is an approach to doing a similar sort of thing for here. So Ian, over to you.
It might well be better for Ollie actually, but what we've done here, I'll give him a break. So what this figure shows is the sewage treatment work catchments in green, and then the blue lines are the river mapping and some of the flood risk zones. The flood zone 3, which indicates the functional floodplain. So what we've done is offset a buffer around the functional floodplain, and beyond that buffer, the chances of connectivity into that main river watercourse decreases. So the bit we're having a little bit more computational difficulty with is, well, you can see there's blue lines that stick out of that, so we need to extend it, so beyond the main river network, and ideally into the surface water flood network that Ollie mentioned earlier on, which will give a lot more blue on this, and therefore a lot more sort of danger zone buffers. But the crux of it is that there will be some areas that are not in this boundary. You can see from this mapping here, there's a lot of dots that we need to essentially filter out, because that's the problem with this approach. So that's why it's taking us longer than we planned. But if you just look at the dendritic bits of river channel, or lines that look like river channel, it's a sort of a buffer approach to those areas that we're looking at. We're currently just getting hold of some more detailed drainage network information that we can superimpose on top that might give us something comparable to the surface water mapping. So we're working on this solution at the moment, but hopefully this sort of gives you a bit of an indication as to what a final output might look like. There's also chance for us to, or opportunity at least, for us to look at changing what's now just a big grey blob into different risk zones. So we could apply different distance buffers to different levels of risk, if that makes sense.
It does, yes. And just for members' understanding, earlier in this presentation, the sewage treatment areas, the catchments, were sort of in red, and this particular map, they're shown in green. But there we are. And like I say, it's an emerging piece of work. So hopefully by this method, ladies and gentlemen, you can see that we're trying to get an additive sort of series of maps. The regulations require us to do a bespoke assessment for every proposal, and we've also got to work out now whether it's acceptable or not. So having the sewage treatment works, the rivers, possibly different zones, depending on the buffers, how big the river is. You can, and if you're not at all connected to a sewage treatment works, and there's no chance of your package treatment system in the countryside, I'm conscious that Mike is going to take a different view in the city where they don't have package treatment works, but we've got to make a start somewhere. And there's nothing going to end up in the river. We may actually have a further distance-based solution, because if you're miles away from a special area of conservation, through percolation and just absorption into the soil, nothing's going to get there. We're going to end up with a risk-based map, and subject to the computational difficulties they've got, it doesn't sound, Ian, like it's very far away.
No, it isn't. No. I mean, we're just talking to Trevor about getting hold of some of the more detailed drainage network data that I think Norfolk Council will certainly hold, and we're looking at that to see. Well, once we've got that, we'll see whether that is comparable to the surface water mapping, and yeah, we'll give you an update next time. But essentially, it's a work in progress. But hopefully, you can see the direction of travel from this.
So conceptually, on the map that's in front of us, with I think it's 100 meters around the sort of what I call the major rivers, you may make that, say, 25 meters buffer around the sort of minor tributaries, and that's sort of the way we'll have a more sophisticated approach.
That's correct. Yeah.
But okay, good. And it's a risk-based approach. Okay, thank you for that. So Graham, you come in there.
Yeah, just a quick one, I suppose. One is, whereas Anglian watering all of this, they're supposed to be treating our wastewater. And secondly, the issue around places like Great Yarmouth, where we build and we dispose to the sea, will become very attractive to developers who will not want to go in the difficult areas and will want to go to the areas where it's easier to build and not be having to deal with mitigations. So I'm a bit worried about the future going forward in the short and the long term, because at the end of the day, if it's too difficult for a developer to prove mitigation, they'll go and find somewhere else to build, and that to me is where they've got to produce less mitigation.
All I'll say to that, Graham, is that the mitigation depends on the amount that's going in, and the approach we're taking by setting aside the Natural England calculator and using our own is because we can see that in the reference example given earlier, the mitigation was knocked down by 75%. And then in other cases, depending on the maps we produce, they may be outside any reasonable impact on a special area of conservation. So by degrees, we have turned a blanket ban into, well, green lights here, amber lights here, and to minimize the number of red lights across. And we've got a consistent data approach, which starts with rough and ready sort of in the next week or so, and then becomes progressively more refined as we get a greater degree of certainty. This isn't, and I think what we're trying to do is get going on a few ones quickly, and then, and progressively unlocking. I'm going to go now, if I may, because I know we've got it's on in the chat, but Phil Courtier, do you want to ask the question about, or answer rather, about Anglian Water and the sewage treatment works? Because we're hopeful of a government announcement on that in the next, well, by Thursday.
Yeah, Graham, in answer to your questions, Anglian Water are again represented on the directors steering group. So they are very much part and parcel of that work. I also meet with them and directors from Anglian Water on a weekly basis at the moment, along with Water Resources East, as we try to continue to work towards an implementation of some solutions. It's worth noting, just as a technical point, in the past there's been a concern that developers couldn't effectively contribute to enhancements at a treatment plant. Clarification has now come from Ofwat that says if it's over and above their programme of improvements, in other words, it's facilitating a development coming in, actually a developer can contribute to enhancements at a specific and specified treatment plant. So that, again, allows us to try and find solutions as we move forward. In terms of your concerns about developers focusing their efforts on those areas that are, shall we say, easier to deliver, I think we all share that concern. The way we're mitigating that is by coming up with a solution to this problem as quickly as we can, minimising the impact and the burden upon developers. And I'm sure that we're going to end up with effectively a portfolio approach where developers can acquire solutions, mitigation solutions, in order to make it as easy as possible so that every developer doesn't have to come up with their bespoke solution to their actual problem that they face. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much. I must admit, in my own mind, I'm thinking we've got brownfield sites in Great Yarmouth which could be developed out, which are not viable at the moment, but this might well make them viable. Just one of those thoughts, that's all.
Yeah, I mean, that's entirely possible. Okay, Andrew Brown, why don't you chip in? And meanwhile, we've got a technical wizard who's going to try and sort out the nonsense that is in this room at the moment, because we can only hear half of it, but there we are.
Yeah, thank you, John. I'm from North Norfolk, as people probably know, and I've recently been appointed the portfolio holder for planning and enforcement, which I've held in the past. I've been invited back. I'm just a little bit uncertain here of how we are looking at the heat map and the risk that we're trying to identify. I think we started off previously with John looking at more restricted areas, downstream areas where he expected nutrient to be, pollution to be more prevalent. I want to know whether, from the point of view of our consultants, Ollie and Ian, whether they are rowing back from that and whether they're looking at the whole catchment area equally with the same criteria. And at what point are we going to test whether this will be acceptable to Nutrient England? Are we going to assume it will be, or are we actually going to engage with them to ascertain whether our modelling in our area is the correct modelling? That's my question.
Okay, I'll come into the first. I'll come on to the first part of that. So no, we're not rowing back from what John has previously discussed. What this is trying to do is to add more nuance, really. So rather than just straight distance from the watercourse, this is where the catchment connectivity I very briefly mentioned at the beginning comes in. So we're looking at distance from watercourses that themselves same thing, but with more refinement and less easy for Natural England to dismiss out of hand, I think.
Okay, yeah. And as regards the push for mitigation, are you treating that as perhaps a secondary consideration at the moment? Are you just concentrating on what is acceptable in nutrient calculator terms and almost putting what we can do to mitigate in our respective districts, so that our planning officers are more comfortable in that direction, moving forward to the long term, if I can put it that way?
Yeah, of course. I mean, if I've understood your question correctly, I think we're progressing the two as parallel work streams. So we focused on at the moment looking at getting the contributing catchments defined and the tool to give developers an idea of how much nutrient loading their proposals will give. We are looking at in parallel the solutions that can be brought forward for mitigation. The work on that is sort of has started, and it's focusing really on the practical solutions. So whether that's things like wetland creation or buffer strips and a whole long list of other things, we'll come later on in the programme to looking at how that could be brought together as in some sort of strategic approach. That's what Ollie was discussing about different policies and ways of getting something sensible that people can apply. Does that answer your question?
And will that be district by district, Ian, so that we have a steer as to what mitigation measures are particularly pertinent or applicable to our particular districts? Is that how it will be structured, or will it be more general? I mean, I guess what I'm trying to get to is sort of how practical and helpful will your advice be to any given district local planning authority?
Yeah, I see what you mean. So I mean, on one level, the solutions will be generic because there are only a certain number of solutions that can work, but we can look into whether they'll be applicable to each district. Yeah, that's certainly something we can cover.
I mean, I think, isn't the answer, Ian, that by doing a map-based approach, and I'm conscious we've shown lots of different maps, each of which is focusing on a certain feature, when we bring it all together into one, with, if you like, which every square metre of within the catchment is either high, medium, or low risk, or very high, high, medium, low, very low. So we try and distill everything into this sort of map of acceptability. We can have a consistent evidence-based approach that's scientifically underpinned. It may well be as we go along this journey, and I think where we are, let's imagine a journey from Norwich to Swaffham. I don't know why I picked Swaffham, but I do. Probably we've gone as far as North Tuddenham so far. We've got to get through Dereham and Scarning and Fransham. I think I'm losing my mind on that before we ever get there. But this is very much early doors. As we go over the few coming months, we'll pass Dereham and Tuddenham and Scarning and all those other places as we get more and more accurate. Clearly, Andrew, as we go along, we're going to have to consider the cumulative effects across the whole catchment, and try and work out, can we buy some reed beds, whether we do it or we just have to pay money to Anglian Water. These are decisions to come. But where I think we are at the moment is having a really good, scientifically underpinned calculator. And secondly, probably a clear idea of where actually nutrient neutrality doesn't apply for the moment. They're in the boonies, they're out of the way, so that we may not be unlocking a huge number of applications, but they might be ones and twos. So let's get the thing going, and as we get through the summer, we'll add in things like distance and percolation and groundwater and all those other things. So I think that's sort of where we are, but this isn't just sort of a question. I suppose this is for the members, really. We can either wait for everything to be done and we'll wait forever, and meanwhile the development industry will go bust and there won't be any roofs over people's heads, or we can have this sort of granny's footsteps approach where we make progress as we can when we can, but each of it underpinned by this scientific rationale. I hope some of you have looked as we've been talking at the appeal court case, which is in the chat, right at the top of the chat. It's really useful because it says, you know, who needs to do what to whom and what is the burden of proof and acceptability. So I think that's important. But I'm going to now take a discussion. So Phil Courtier, Mike Stonnard and Mark Ashwell in that order. And then if you want to add, you know what to do, put yourself in the chat.
Thanks, John. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself earlier. So, Andrew, I'm Director of Place for Broadland and South Norfolk, but I also chair the Directors Forum that's overseeing this work at the moment across the catchment area. So, just so you're aware. From my perspective, it's important to note as part of this discussion, this does not preclude developers, notably the larger developers, coming up with their own solutions. So we are looking to bring forward, whether it's a portfolio of mitigation or whatever it is, we're acting in this way to provide future developers an option that they can effectively buy, acquire the mitigation package that we will ultimately be putting together. And that will be a mix, I'm sure, of different things, such as wetland creation, such as enhancements to Anglian water infrastructure and other methods. But it also allows developers to choose, if they so wish, their own route to mitigation and demonstrating that to your planning team as and when they come forward. But it is important that we have a consistent approach across catchments in terms of things such as the calculator, but there will also potentially be bespoke solutions at a more local level between the different districts. Thank you, Chair.
And there might even be a bespoke solution for a particular individual development at a particular point. So, you know, all of this is allowed for. Mike Stonnard.
So I think the work on the calculator, the local iteration is really, really good. And that's really good progress. And I think actually the presentation has been very clear, and I think there's some really great work going on. The one thing that stood out for me when we were talking about having a more local risk-based approach and looking at nutrient supply and connectivity mapping and so forth, was the statement in the presentation that Natural England does not accept this approach and that there's a risk of challenge. And I think there's a fundamental question for us, I suppose, of whether or not we want to take the risk of a challenge and everything which would go with that, reputational, financial, all of that, or whether or not we want to do all the mitigation work we are, but actually work alongside Natural England. And I'm concerned. I mean, we have had legal advice about the legality of doing this, and that it would not be legal, although I accept there's alternative advice. So, you know, it is something which could be settled in the courts. But is that really a route we want to go down? I mean, I don't think the City Council is at all has any appetite to do, yeah, gung ho. It has an appetite really to do that. But I suspect that it doesn't apply in the City Council area anyway. It's not something that we would have the option to do in any case. So, you know, there's a question about whether or not any authorities want to go it alone, I suppose. So, you know, that's where I'm at. Not comfortable about taking the risk, but it might be that that's not something that we could consider in the city anyway.
Mike, what I'd do is to give you reassurance on that is, and I've just put it again in the chat, so take the URL, but to everyone on this call, I would commend reading the Court of Appeal rules on the Natural England nutrient neutrality guidance, because it makes it quite clear that we are the responsible body as individual planning authorities. Clearly, we want to act in concert like we are today. We are entitled to take cogent reasoning, having taken advice from suitably scientifically qualified people, and I don't suppose anybody's going to leave this call without thinking that Hasconings are exactly, you know, the sort of scientifically based people with a track record there. So I think, you know, and furthermore, the absolutism that I think we've previously been told about, you know, just a single particle of phosphate is enough to stymie anything, is absolutely debunked by the Court of Appeal ruling there. So I would commend all of that to you. We are not trespassing, I don't believe, by this approach into some sort of random sort of legal minefield here. The Court of Appeal over the weekend has laid out a really clear path of civil responsibilities and tolerances, and I think we're following that. So the risks, which I think we all need to be concerned about as public authorities, are less than you might have thought. But we can all form our own views having read the thing. Mark Ashwell, why don't you come in now?
So I was just going to ask about mitigation, whether we've already got to a point where we know that a significant part of development that needs to be unlocked is going to be dependent upon off-site mitigation involving third parties and other landowners. And I think Phil suggested there was other work already going on, but for me, if we get to sort of February or spring next year and we've got a report from Royal Haskonian that says these types of mitigation will deliver these types of benefits, at that point it would also be nice to have approved schemes in place that we can offer to the development industry. So rather than a list of, if you do this, you'll be okay, if we know that the local authorities collectively are going to have to be engaged in some sort of tariff-based system or something that we've got control over, it would be nice to have that at least being worked on in parallel with the Royal Haskonian work, so that we're actually in a position early next year to say we know what mitigation looks like, because this Royal Haskonian have told us this is what it looks like, this is what it delivers. And we've also got a package of these types of mitigation which are available for those developers who've not done the job themselves. So we're sort of in a position to move quickly on it.
Mark, I'm going to come to Phil Courtier. He's got the answer for that, I think.
Yeah,
but just to reiterate, I think for all members, there are three legs on this stool. The first one is how much. Now, have a proper calculator. How much nitrogen and phosphate is being produced? Secondly, okay, so we know how much phosphate is being produced by development. Secondly, for a particular location on the map, does it matter? But where it does matter, the third stool is how on earth are we going to help people, and whether the councils in parallel procure reed beds and sell them off per square metre, or whatever. Or whether we broker a macro umbrella deal with Anglian Water that says for every house you can pay £1,000 to Anglian Water and the problem magically goes away. I don't know whether that's an option. But Phil Courtier, you're leading on this. Did you just want to give some of the other examples that we're working on in parallel to the work with Haskonian?
Yeah, Mark, it's a really good question, and one that I can assure you that I concur with it, and we are working to effectively not put a implementation package in sequentially, but that we run these things in parallel, so that towards the end of the year and into spring, we are able to have what I'm describing as a portfolio of mitigation in place. And in fact, the directors group have agreed the appointment of David Edwards. David Edwards is an EALGA consultant who's worked on the Greater Norwich local plan previously, and he's on this call, and his role is to help us across the catchment as we now work towards an implementation stage, even in advance of the work that Royal Haskonian are progressing. And that sort of portfolio, in my mind, I'm envisaging it like an investment portfolio, a financial investment portfolio. You have some things, you'll invest in multiple stocks and shares. Some of them will provide a quick return. Some of them will be providing a long-term return. Some will give you a very high return. Some will give you a less of a return, but it all averages out. And in the same way, a mitigation package, a portfolio approach that may include the wetland creation and work being done by WRE at the moment. It will include hard infrastructure that can be delivered by Anglian Water. It will include things such as sediment traps and perhaps some farming practices that we can address. It will include green infrastructure to capture runoff from fields. And if you have that whole portfolio, you can introduce perhaps green infrastructure around field boundaries very quickly. Wetlands may take 2 years to implement, 3 years to implement. Hard infrastructure from Anglian Water, again, could be, in some cases, relatively quick. And what we end up with, that portfolio that I would, as agreeing with you, I would like to see that in place as we enter into next year.
Okay, right. Look, oh, wait a minute. There's one more person. Tim, you better ask me the question and I'll repeat it for you.
Okay, I think this is a really good example of collaborative work. I think the key things that we all want to get down eutrophication pressure and get the planning system moving. It seems to me that I think Mike's point is right, that picking a fight over this with Natural England over some of this isn't going to get it done quickly. So I think the portfolio you've just been describing is exactly the way to get this moving. And just to get to that position where Haskoni can offer us a series of solutions that a developer can buy effectively to get the planning system moving. That's the way we'll get out of this as quickly as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, we have to recognise that we are going to work with stakeholders. We are working with stakeholders, and that will carry on. I have let us not underestimate the impact upon our SME builders within some of the rural areas. And whilst, yes, I agree that the portfolio approach is the strategic and best approach to land this in due course, I am prepared to continue to explore and encourage the exploration of a risk-based approach that has been described, not looking to just go into confrontation with Natural England, but if we can get even a handful of those smaller schemes going again, where we are protecting small builders from going bankrupt through this time of uncertainty, then I am prepared to continue to explore that, not in a gung-ho way, but in a clear and measured way, working with Royal Haskoning on a scientifically based approach. So I understand the concerns, but at this point in time, the stakes are so high, especially for some of our smaller and medium-sized businesses, that I think we need to continue just to explore that as an interim measure, having regard to the reduced burden through the calculator work as well.
Good, right. I say we've been going at this for an hour and 3/4, although it took us 15 minutes to get going on the IT. So I'm going to try and sum up, if I may. I think Mike, did you want to come in just briefly? Sorry, I've seen you indicated.
Just to say, John, so what we might agree today is the portfolio approach continues, as Phil has just outlined, but that there will be other work on a risk-based approach. We're not committing to implementing any of that. What we're committing to is looking at where there might be opportunities, but we're not about to agree that we're going to get into a battle with Natural England. But we're just going to carry those two pieces of work in parallel, and then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it later on, if there do look like being some opportunities in terms of how Natural England might react to it. And that's a decision for another day.
Okay. Let me sum up, and then we'll put those questions, if we may, in a moment. Okay, so look, what we've seen today in quite a wide-ranging conversation, supported by Ian and Oliver from Haskoning, is a very thoughtful scientific approach. I think that's the first point. And I don't think anyone on this call would doubt their scientific credentials. And I think that's not only being nice to Ian and Oliver, because I think we need to be, they're going to be part of the solution, but also in the Court of Appeal judgment today, any advice or any position that we take has to be informed by scientific approaches and suitably qualified people. Expert assertion will not be enough. So I think in terms of our route out of this muddle, hiring Haskoning has been a really good thing. We've seen some progress. Already they have tweaked the zones of influence, because we heard how very square and lumpy it was, how very coarse the Natural England buff-coloured zone was. We've managed to zoom in and really refine that to local circumstances. That's a win already. We saw that on the Cromer Ridge. They've tweaked the values and on a calculator and developed a calculator. I think that's really good, and that's nearly ready to go. I mean, it's days, not weeks. So that's enormous progress, and we've seen the outcome of that on a specimen application in Dereham, which knocked it down by 75%. So that's really good progress. That means that the mitigation effects may be significantly less intrusive and expensive as we go forward to what they might otherwise have been. We've seen huge progress on the mapping. And the mapping is important because, again, the Court of Appeal requires a bespoke assessment to be done for every development proposal. So by laying out where the risks are, the risk-based approach on a map, we can then judge uniquely for every proposal, whether it's here, there, or wherever it is, whether it's likely to be high risk, low risk, even acceptable completely. But what we've also seen is that there are whole swathes of Norfolk in the countryside that aren't covered by any sewage treatment works at all. And these will always rely on packaged treatment plants or some sort of land drain system, and they may be acceptable today. And I think there's a work for the officers to have a look at to see whether in a very limited way, although it's a large geographical territory, because they're in the open countryside, we don't normally allow new dwellings, we may be able to unlock a few barn conversions or something like that. What we've also seen, I think, in summary, is a cogent approach. And that cogent approach is really useful because, again, the Court of Appeal ruling requires us to have cogent approach. It makes it absolutely clear that we can quite lawfully disagree, not my words, they're the words of the President of the Court of Appeal, we can lawfully disagree with Natural England, provided we take a cogent approach. And I think that's a really key piece of understanding. We can have reasonable doubt. We do not have to have the threshold of absolute certainty I think some of us have been previously labouring with. So I think we've got a way of unlocking small developments, and we'll have more refinement as we go along with distance percolation, groundwater and so forth. But in parallel, David Edwards, who we've worked on in Greater Norwich before, he's an independent consultant, a hired gun, is going to try and work out to find out where we can have some of these mitigations, which may be reed beds, working with Anglian Water. I'm trying to think of the full list, but there's a whole series there. So in essence, I think we've probably had a really good knock around on this. Everyone should be much better apprised and informed. So I think that's good. I don't think any of us should be surprised if in the next week or so, planning officers, certainly in the countryside areas where there are one or two that aren't on treatment works, are able to start to release some of these pent up demand, and then we'll have a further update in September. Now, is that a fair summation of where I think we've got to? I'm looking at you, Phil. Is that happy? Are you happy with that?
I'm ecstatic with that. The sense that we,
the
sense we may be approving applications next week, but I appreciate your ambition, and we will continue to work to expedite this as quickly as we can.
And then we'll get to phase 2 in September, and we'll progressively widen that out. Okay. Oliver and Ian, thank you very much. You've worked very diligently, and there's this sort of laid out approach, and I think we're all grateful. Mike, did you just want to have a final word? Because I think in my summarization, I think we agreed most of your things, Mike, but if you want to put the question, we can take a vote.
No. So basically, so are we saying that based on the mapping and based on the fact that there are some areas in the rural areas which are not on the mains sewage, and therefore this doesn't apply to them? I think that's what the argument is. So are we saying that planning officers in those areas might start issuing consents in the near future, or would that come back here for further discussion before it happened? And the other question is, does that matter to us in the city? Because we're certainly not going to be doing it.
Well, there's no countryside in the city, yeah. I think that this is a technical thing for planning officers to discuss. I think we've seen from the draft maps that Ian and Oliver have screened, there's a fair bit of more work to be done on tidying them up and making them pretty and getting the right scales. But Phil, you're Director of Planning in South Norfolk and Broad. What do you think?
Yeah, Mike, I think what this does, it opens up at least that conversation, but because it's within that catchment area, each planning officer for every single planning application will now have to carry out an appropriate assessment, and they will have to engage with Natural England before they actually issue a decision. John's right that they are still the competent authorities that can have regard to those comments and not be dictated by them. So it allows that process to at least start where they can have a conversation to say, is there a direct connectivity between this proposed application and the respective SACs? If it's concluded that it's not, then they may be in a position where they can issue those decisions. I don't think that needs to come back to this board because that is acting in the autonomy of as a local or planning authority, and there will be coordination between the districts through the district planning group and through the directors group to make sure we're approaching this in a consistent way. The final point is, you are right, that particular issue doesn't affect the city.
Hey, but what we might do, Phil, and I'm sorry I've introduced us at this late point. Charlie Banner, QC for developers, says that outline planning permissions don't have to take this into account, whereas Simon Bird says, I think they probably do. So we may get a third opinion, sort of bit of a tie break going forward, and I'm just assuming this is all covered by the whole thing.
Yes, I think there's a benefit in, and especially in light of some authorities such as Durham and Winchester have now started issuing reserved matter applications in certain circumstances, and Natural England haven't challenged that decision to date of those authorities. So in light of the fact that nationally across the country there are different QC's advice, and we have Charlie Banner who's saying one thing and Simon Bird saying another, there may be some benefit, again, with leaders' agreement, that we go out and get a third opinion in light of those two.
Good. And in the meantime, we understand the government's going to clip Natural England's wings before Thursday anyway, so let's keep our fingers crossed for that. Okay, right, that brings this item to a close. I think we're happy with that, aren't we? Good. Sorry it's dragged on a bit, but this is so important. The economic development, for getting roofs over people's heads and so forth. I think it's important we all dip our arms in the blood there. Thanks, Ian and Oliver. You can stay if you like to listen to recreational impact avoidance mitigation strategies, or you can go and do something else. But if you're in the air conditioned in your office, I'd stay where you are because it's hot out there. Good, right. Okay, thanks. Let's move on now, if we may. The next item on the agenda is just really an update. It's a written paper. I mean, time's getting on. We could just accept it. Or Trevor, did you just want to add a little bit on the GRAMs?
Yes, thank you. I can do. I'll keep it very brief as we haven't got much time left. Just the two elements of the GIRAMS work that remain outstanding at the moment. So we have to set up the governance and management of the fund. And we also are looking to review the mitigation package from the previous work that was conducted by Place Services. With regard to the management and the governance of the fund, members broadly agreed in December to the principle of the County Council being the accountable body for and hosting organisation for the mitigation. We've set up a steering group, and this has been working on the finer details and arrangements of the mitigation. We've created a terms of reference for the overarching board and a job description for the delivery officer role. We're working through the financial and legal implications of the county council being the sort of accountable body, and we think we've just about found a way through that now in the last couple of days. So hopefully we'll be able to progress that and give you a better update at the next member forum. The other piece of work that we're doing at the moment is around the mitigation strategy and the review of the one that was produced by Place Services. I think we're just about in the position now where we've agreed a tariff. We've agreed a brief for the work, and we propose now to go out to tender for that work and then commission that as quickly as we can. So hopefully we can give you a much better update on the progress at the next member forum.
Good. And Natural England are happy with this? Those people again?
Yes.
Hey, that's fantastic. Good. Well, in that case, let's quit while we're ahead on that one. Unless anybody else has got any questions, no one's indicating. Right, so let's move now on to neighbouring counties update. Is there one? Oh, no, there is some from Suffolk. Oh, who's? Hang on, somebody from Suffolk. Make yourself known.
Yeah, I'm here
Ross.
from Suffolk. Sorry, Cameron is on annual leave at the moment, so I'm substituting in for him. But he has given me a list of updates if you would like to hear them.
Briefly.
Briefly, I will be brief. So, just what he's asked me to pass on is that West Suffolk are currently undertaking consultation for their preferred options until the 26th of July, so the end of next week. Baber and Mid Suffolk joint local plan examination is currently underway with the consultation on main modifications expected in autumn. Ipswich Borough Council have adopted their local plan, that was back in March, I'm sure. And East Suffolk are continuing work on the new supplementary planning documents and submitting their new sill charging scheme for examination currently. And that is all.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Well, good luck with getting a new sill charging thing forward.
Thank you.
I'm sure everyone's going to be whinging on viability, but there we are.
Yeah.
Right, so thank you for that. Moving on to number 6, which is the local plan update. There's a whole series of neighbourhood plans, emerging neighbourhood plans. I mean, this is a factual document. I think we just need to receive that. And then there's a summary of adopted emerging local plans in the whole thing there. So by just reviewing that, and no one's commented, we are exercising our duty to cooperate. We are cooperating on all of them. Hurrah. Right, okay, I think we're done. Next forum, when do we think? September, October, probably when we get the next iteration from Haskonia, I think. Brilliant. Okay, with 2 minutes to go, we're going to quit. Thanks very much indeed. And then we're going to see if we can make this ghastly conference system work. And it's been much easier for you sitting at home in the heat than it has been for us basking in the air conditioning, because everything's come out 3 times and it's just been really bad. But there we are. Ho-hum. We'll see if we can get those fixed for next time. And we'll try and meet in person at the next time as well. Okay, thanks very much indeed. Bye.